The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that time, Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humble, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
We Sri Lankans these days, for the last few months, we often have conversations, discussions wherever we meet about our country. Obviously, we all talk about our politicians. For the last 74 years, they have deceived us, they have taken us for a ride, they have destroyed this land, whatnot. We always say that. So if you ask ourselves the question, have they deceived us, or have we deceived ourselves? It's a fair question, because they have deceived us, yes, of course, but we have also deceived ourselves. There is what you call self-deception. And not only in politics and in social life, we also deceive ourselves in our personal relationships as well. And that is why often we hear, I fell in love with this man or with this woman. I thought he is the most wonderful man or the most wonderful woman to be with. And I went ahead with marriage thinking that everything will be perfect. But now I realize this is not all that what I saw. So he has taken me for a ride. Yes, or she has taken me for a ride. Yes, they have, but then I have deceived myself as well. So when you talk about deception or taking someone for a ride, it is also because we have this problem of deceiving ourselves. Now, why do I talk about self-deception both in politics and social life and also in relationships? It is also in our prayer life. Today, the liturgy of the word, the gospel passage taken from the Gospel of Luke, tells us about self-deception in one's prayer. Jesus shares this parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. Both of them go to the temple. And of course, the moment you say a Pharisee is a man who belongs to the religious community of his time. They were the ones who went to the temple. They were the ones who offered sacrifices. They were the ones who maintained the tradition and the customs of the faith. So they were all so-called good men or good men and women of their time. So Jesus says, a Pharisee goes to the temple as well as a tax collector. Now, who is a tax collector? The opposite of the Pharisees, because they were out there. They were public sinners, as it were. No one had any regard for them. They were out there making money, taking bribes, into corruption, hiding the wealth of the people, hiding their own wealth from others. So Jesus says both of them went to the temple and prayed. But he says that in the prayer of the Pharisee, there was a clear self-deception. Why? His prayer is not with God, but with himself and with the others. But the tax collector, as it were, though he was a public sinner and recognized as an unworthy man to go to the temple, Jesus says he had the proper attitude of prayer. There was no self-deception in his prayer to his God. And Jesus makes this attitude of prayer of the two individuals. As Jesus says, when Pharisees started praying, he took up his position and raised his hands. He was in the mood of prayer, but his prayer was full of self-deception. He was deceiving himself, and it is always proper, it's always normal that when you are someone who has a wrong attitude, your prayer is also a result of that which is wrong. So Jesus says, from the two of them, it is the tax collector who went home justified. Now, when you talk about prayer, my dear friends, the first reading today taken from the book of Sirach, which is an Old Testament text, which was supposed to be written by a Jewish instructor, a man of wisdom, giving instructions about day-to-day life, and especially the life of prayer. He says something that was summarizing what it means to be praying. He goes on to say this: the prayer of the humble pierces the clouds, and he will not be consoled until it reaches the Lord. Now, the author of the book of Sirach, about 5-6 centuries before the time of Christ, giving instructions about prayer, he says, if you are a humble person, your prayer will pierce the clouds and reach the Lord, and your prayer will be answered. Now, what does it mean to be humble? If you go to the etymology of the word humble, it comes from the Latin root humus, which is the word for soil. And that is why the word human and humility both comes from the Latin root humus, which means that in order to be human, we all have to be like the soil. What does it mean to be like the soil? Because when you take the earth, my dear friends, most of us don't pay much attention to the soil. We take it all for granted. But everything on this earth is depending on what the soil brings out. We all are standing on soil now. This building is built on soil. The trees are grown on soil. Everything that we have in life is on top of what is brought out by the soil. But soil doesn't have any recognition. It's almost nothing. But at the same time, it is everything. So you can see that when you are a humble person, you become like the soil. There are no pretensions about yourself. There is nothing that you talk about yourself. C.S. Lewis, a great Christian writer, he says, to be humble is not to think less of yourself, but to think of yourself less. That means, here I am living my life. I am doing what I am called to do, and I do everything that I possibly can, and I am nothing in this world. So the humility comes with a man or a woman who has found the soilness of one's life. That is, I'm nothing, but at the same time, if I serve the purpose of who I am, then I am everything. So the prayer of the humble will pierce the Lord, the cloud, so that it reaches the Lord. So in our prayer, my dear friends, as it happened in the story or the parable, the tax collector, he went to the temple and he openly said, I am nothing. I am nobody. I'm neither religious, I'm not a Pharisee. He didn't say anything about what the others were doing. His prayer included his own reality of his own life. He admitted who he was. And then he pleaded with the Lord, have mercy on me. So therefore, my dear friends, the right attitude of prayer is the humility that we have within ourselves. The second reading taken from the letter of St. Paul to Timothy, which we have been reflecting during the last few weeks. Paul is at this time writing from the prison. And it's interesting to see that Paul was in prison at that time, and also he thought that he was going to be killed. So at the last moment or last stages of his life, he's writing to his own disciple who was in Ephesus, and he writes about his own attitude about his own life. He says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering. Now, when he refers to a drink offering, it was the custom in the Jewish sacrifice where you take wine, which is your product, what you bring forth with your labor, and on the temple sacrifice table, you pour out the wine. And he says, I'm like the wine that is poured out on the altar. And he sees his life as something that is completely emptied out. And he says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. So you see, my dear friends, in the first reading you have the importance of having deep humility in your life before you pray and before you start saying your prayers. The second is that you have the attitude of completely emptying yourself out for the Lord, as Paul did, because it is only when we have that deep, profound attitude of prayer that our prayer becomes a meaningful one. And also, my dear friends, when you talk about prayer, they say, we all in our lifetime will pray. Now, today we pray, and tomorrow we will pray, and we will pray for the rest of our lives. But then there is going to be a prayer that each and every one of us will have to one day say it, and that is the moment of our death. My whole life will be summarized in the way I see death coming. We don't know when it will be. Wherever the time, whatever the place, my dear friends, as Paul prayed at this time in his own life, we will all be able to pray if we have a proper attitude of life. Paul had that attitude of life because he says, I am now giving myself away completely. When you talk about this attitude of life which comes out in the last moment of our life, my dear friends, a great psychologist, Carl Jung, a co-founder of the science of psychology with Sigmund Freud, he says something very beautiful about life. He says, in the first half of life, all of us want to gather things for ourselves. Maybe if we'll say we live for 80 years. First 40, we want to gather up. We want education, we want money, we desire wealth, we save whatever for the future, and that's all normal for a normal human person. Then he says, when you come to the second half of life, in your 50s, 60s, 70s, then you realize you're not going to take everything that you have. And you begin to think of life. And in the second half of life, what we all have to do in order to be psychologically normal, he says, learn to give away. Learn to give away. When you learn to give away in the second half of life, then you will realize what life is all about. So Paul had that attitude for life. He knew the best way to live is to become a libation, to become like wine that is poured out, completely emptying out, so that I will go to my final destination with all what I have within myself. That is why the great spiritual writer Thomas Merton, he writes when talking about life, he says, when we leave this world, what we will take is what we have given away. What I have given away in my life will be all what I take when I leave this world. So therefore, my dear friends, the attitude of life, the attitude of my own journey of faith in this world will be seen so clearly in our prayer. And that is why Jesus makes this comparison. One is praying with himself and with the others. The other one is praying with himself and with his Creator. The prayer of the two is very different because one is into complete self-deception. Because in politics and in social life, we are deceived and we deceive ourselves. In relationships, we are deceived and we deceive ourselves. But in the life of prayer, if we are falling into the whole problem of self-deception, my dear friends, the entire meaning of prayer will be lost to us. Let us ask ourselves, how do I pray? What does my prayer include? Is it myself and others? Or it's myself and my Creator?